welcome everyone to today's Tuesday Times Roundtable. We're glad that you made it and hopefully had a time to grab some lunch and hopefully had time to grab coffee before they took it away. If they haven't taken it away yet, they just took it. So hopefully you had a chance to get some, if anything. And also, if this is your first Tuesday Times Roundtable ever or of the semester and don't have a schedule yet, please grab a schedule before leaving because we are here every single week with interesting conversation and free food. So I'm going to introduce today's moderator, one of the best friends of global learning at the university, I would say, Dr. Laura Boudon, who currently is the director of study abroad here at FIU. Before doing that, though, she worked at the Herbert Wertheim College of Medicine here at FIU for more than 4 years, and she was in the role of Associate Director for International Programs. So we definitely see the global thread through her career in academia at FIU. She also served for several years as an adjunct faculty member in the School of Social Work. She has more than 10 years of professional experience in higher education administration, including at Georgetown University, American University, and the University of South Carolina. She's been at FIU since 2009. She has graduate degrees in international relations and social work, and she has her PhD from FIU in international relations. Her dissertation, which I find interesting every time I read it, every time she does a roundtable, is based on the international political economy of coffee. And she enjoys travel very much in her spare time, including hiking, great food, and photography. So I'm going to turn it over for today's very interesting discussion to Dr. Laura Boudon.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and happy to participate in the Tuesday Times Roundtable. I think my motto for these is it's really about the conversation, so I'm hoping that all of you will speak up and express your opinions on this. Our topic for today is Ebola and travel warnings. And I guess before I get started, I'm going to make one plug for the Office of Study Abroad. We do have our Study Abroad Fair tomorrow here on MMC from 10 to 3 in the GC pit. So if you're interested, thinking about studying abroad this summer, or maybe just want to know what some options are, FIU proper has about 40 study abroad programs that go out every year. So there probably is a program that you might be interested in. But I won't say any more. Join us tomorrow in the GC pit. So as I said, our topic today is Ebola and travel warnings, and you should have a couple of articles. So I just want to start out a little bit. Have you heard about Ebola recently? Is it still in the news? Okay. But in the fall, it seems like that's all we heard about, right? So what is the most recent news that you have heard about Ebola or that you remember hearing about Ebola? Okay. It might be Nigeria. That's possible. What other things have you heard? Yes.
The gentleman who died in London, that was the last one I heard.
Okay, and can you say more about that? Because maybe I missed that.
That's all I heard, that one gentleman died from Ebola in London. That was
like in January or something? Or
yeah,
recently. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but if you remember in the fall, it feels like the news cycle was all about Ebola all the time, right? And what was going on here, what was going on there. And obviously we had cases, we had a few cases here in the US, and then we had a few cases in Spain, so outside of West Africa. So just a couple of things about where Ebola is. I did a little research in preparation for today. So almost 9,000 people have died, mostly in West Africa, from Ebola. And thankfully, one of the reasons that Ebola is not so much in the news right now is that the number of cases every week has dropped significantly. So in September and October, every week there were 300 new cases of Ebola in West Africa. And for example, 2 weeks ago, there was only 8 new cases. So that's a significant drop in the number of new cases, which is in part why we're not hearing quite as much about it. But let's talk some facts for a minute. So what do you know? What do you know about Ebola? What is Ebola? Okay, that's a good place to start. So how could you get Ebola? Okay. Okay, you're onto something important. Yes.
Physical contact with any bodily fluids from a person who is in, I guess, in a certain stage of Ebola infection.
Okay, very good. Other thoughts? What else do you know about Ebola?
It kind of spreads like AIDS because it goes through bodily fluids and through like contact with other blood or like corpse and things of that nature. But like if someone just like cough on you, unless they're like spitting out blood or anything, you're not gonna get it from them.
Exactly. So all of you actually know a good amount about Ebola. That's really good. So it has to be physical contact with the bodily fluids, um, and you know, coughing and that kind of thing. You would not get um, Ebola. Um, what is so you mentioned specifically, you know, bodily contact, right? So what has been in West Africa one of the ways or one of the situations in which many people have contracted Ebola?
Birth, childbirth,
Okay.
and like helping them rear a child.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Like when they like for the funerals, like the deceased bodies, or those who are deceased or like level sanitation, those who like when they use the restroom, things of that nature.
Okay. So, in case you could not hear, she mentioned funerals, which has actually been a very an important aspect to the spread of Ebola, because in many West African cultures, um, during the burial ceremonies or during the funeral ceremonies following the death of a loved one, many of these ceremonies involve touching the person who has died, touching the body, holding the body, carrying the body, preparing the body for burial. And one of the things with Ebola is that at that moment, especially obviously the person has died from Ebola, the body is still extremely, extremely contagious. So many who have touched the body of someone who has died from Ebola, um, were contracting Ebola from that, from that contact. Um, and in fact, yesterday on NPR, they did a piece about imams in Guinea who are really trying to get the word out about how, obviously tradition is important, but for the safety of, everyone in Guinea, sometimes rituals and practices need to be adjusted for the good of the public, right? Um, so that's an important aspect. Um, what else do you know about Ebola?
It's very very deadly. Like within a couple of days, like to a week, the person doesn't get help, they die instantly.
So once you show symptoms of Ebola, then you could die within a few days.
The death rate is like really, I mean when it was going on last semester, the death rate was like really really high. The percentage was like over 60-70%.
Yeah, it's about 70%. So yes, you're right on. And one of the things about Ebola that may be different from other infectious diseases is that it could have an incubation period of 21 days, which if you think about it, that's a long time, right? If you're returning from somewhere or traveling somewhere else, waiting 21 days to know for sure, that you don't have Ebola, that can be a long time, and especially if you are placed, in quarantine, which obviously happened. So that's a very long time to be, but that's a fact, and that's important for us to know. So you have the couple of articles from the New York Times, and obviously Ebola in the news in the fall was it has this outbreak was exclusively in West Africa, except for the few cases that came out of West Africa to Spain and to the U.S. and to London, as you mentioned. So one of the questions, before we get into travel warnings and everything, one of the questions I want to invite you to think about is, would the response, and we can narrow it, I guess, to the U.S. response, would the U.S. response to Ebola have been different if Ebola were not in West Africa? Let me hear from someone that I haven't heard from yet. Yes?
I believe it would have been. For example, Canada or Mexico, because they border the USA, and maybe a place where we have a lot of people come from, like United Kingdom, France, or even portions of the Middle East, especially if it's gotten into the armed forces.
Okay. Other thoughts about, and we'll focus specifically on the U.S. response as opposed to maybe more broadly. Yes?
I think it just comes down to like national interests in the region. I don't think compared to like other regions like Europe, South America, plus proximity, there's really, I guess it wasn't as urgent the response as it would have been if we had more like interest in that area. Because you really have to look at the area. It's, I mean, development-wise, it's categorized as third world. I mean, we don't really get much from them in terms of resources. So I think that's why my perspective on how it was my big response.
Okay.
I wanted to piggyback on what you said about the resources. Actually, a lot of the Western countries like UK, Europe, US, they got a lot of resources from Africa. Especially in West Africa, they have a lot of oil. Especially like Ebola was in Nigeria temporarily, they get a lot of oil from Nigeria. They got a lot of resources from those countries. So I mean, it is national interest. But I mean, let's say maybe Ebola was maybe around the area where they're getting their resources from. There would have been more news attention right away, in my opinion. But maybe because because where the Ebola cases were located, it had nothing to do with the U.S. interest. They didn't really, cover it until it came over here. That's just my opinion. But they get lots of resources in Africa, a lot of resources.
Other thoughts on the U.S. response? I mean, what would have the U.S. response been if Ebola started in, say, France?
They pretty much covered it. I mean, it just boiled down to interest. Because they knew about it, it just wasn't a sense of urgency on our government's part to do something about it right then.
And so when go ahead.
Sorry, it could also probably have something to do with the traffic. I mean, there's a lot more traffic, like you were saying, from France or from Europe than there is, quite frankly, from Africa. It's not the case necessarily with just interest, but it's also the purchasing power of the individual in these countries. The United States sees it as, well, there's nothing really that we can get out of them, so we can afford a restriction on travel to that country or from that country. Whereas we can't necessarily afford restrictions from France or from England, etc.
Okay, and that'll be a good point to come back to when we get into the discussion about travel warnings specifically.
We have to look at the internal forces and the external forces within the U.S. because at the time, the U.S. was dealing with foreign policy issues, especially dealing with Russia and Ukraine, and there was another aspect of Syria. And then after that, internally, you saw news reports on the shootings like Mike Brown or the protests going on. So with that, U.S. interest was definitely focused on the U.S. and not really on what's going on in Africa.
So when did we really see the U.S. government begin to focus and respond on the issue of Ebola?
When a U.S. citizen came back to the U.S.
Like global health.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm taking it back.
I have to, I guess, admit that I am not even positive what the U.S. federal government's response to fighting Ebola in West Africa was, because a lot of when I think of what was the U.S.'s response, some of the things that come to mind are everything from Mark Zuckerberg getting resources to it, to FIU sending one of our own FIU doctors over there. So I can picture in my mind a lot of institutions from the United States contributing to the fight. But now that you pose the question you're posing it, I don't really know what the U.S. and the federal government did compared to private citizens and organizations, including FIU, within the U.S.
And I think that's a good point. Obviously, our federal government is large, so not all entities are going to be involved. But you would see the U.S. Department of State would be obviously involved. And I think unlike in other situations that involve international situations, I think the Center for Disease Control was front and center and actually providing a lot of resources. But even they weren't really focused on it until it came to the U.S. And then as soon as there was the one case in Texas, then there were scares in a variety of other places. Yes.
Like when that happened, when we had our own citizens involved, affected, but the way the media reacted was kind of like chastising like that person for getting involved in helping out or bringing it back to our country. Like it was such a put those people in such a negative light for risking their lives for going there, but they put like negative spin to it, like oh no, you're going over there to help another country fight this outbreak, but then you're threatening the safety of the country by bringing it back.
Yeah, to add on to his, I remember a lot of people scrutinizing the U.S. for bringing back some of the doctors that were infected, and people saying like, why would you do that? I even remember somebody that I know saying that they would have rather have died in Africa than to be that person that brought it over here and started it, which I thought was absolutely ridiculous. But there was a lot of negative light.
Well, I think exactly what you're saying gets to the core, actually, of the issue and to the core of what I think it would be good for us to talk about today, which is, the individual that I think you're referring to is the nurse in the Northeast, right? Who, it turns out she didn't have Ebola, but because she had gone to help, and there was fear, and in some ways, probably panic on the part of public individuals who maybe didn't understand, everything about Ebola and so forth. They really made this person who took from her own time and her own resources to go and help in West Africa, and then came back and was placed, at least temporarily, in isolation without knowing that she had Ebola at all, and it turned out that she didn't have Ebola.
Just to add another perspective to the whole Ebola case, it's I think it's important that we also understand that the fact that Ebola was started in Africa, the whole media take on it. A lot of Americans they don't know Africa. Nobody really knows what Africa is. Nobody has taken the time out of their time to actually research the continent and really get down and see, okay, these are also people like how we are over here. So the fact that when Ebola was in Africa, people were looking at it as if oh, Africa is this where all these diseases come from and all these things go from. So people are going crazy about it. People were even I'm Nigerian, so people were. I have a friend. His name is Abiola. It's not Ebola. People were making fun of his name. People were saying, "Oh, you're African. Don't touch me." Don't do this. People were very. And the question is, why are they doing this? It has a lot to do with history of relations between Africa and other countries, and that also had a negative impact on how Ebola was seen in the media here in the U.S. and in the U.K. Because I have friends in the U.K. and they tell me what the news looks like over there. So I think it's very important that we also see that aspect of it as well. Because I feel like if Ebola was to start in Europe or somewhere else, I don't think it would have been as negative or as harsh as the media was because it was in Africa. That's just my opinion.
And I think the point that you're emphasizing is the lack of education regarding Ebola specifically, and the lack of understanding of Africa, which for sure is something we need to work on, I would say.
It's interesting what she's saying about how people perceive Africa, because actually me and my friends, we were in China, over the fall for we were doing study abroad, and it's interesting how you take the nationalistic perspective of how it was boiled down to. So basically, Africa, like you're saying, is like the bottom of the totem pole, national, international. People see Africa and our countries within Africa as basically failed states. These are countries that they cannot do anything without the help of the international public. And so when something goes wrong or awry in Africa, it's just, oh, because they can't. They're failures, you know? If something happens in the United States, as it did, then it starts happening, the dialogue changes to, oh, this is something that your country has to combat, and if you can't, then your country is almost or close to not being able to function, just like something in Africa, right? So it brings down the value of your nation. In China, a lot of the news outlets were saying, were boasting the fact that there was no outbreaks of Ebola in China, and that they've been putting into place things and steps to make sure that it doesn't. So it turns into like this nationalistic approach as our nation can take care of it better than yours can. So it's like this international perspective that it's really all about identity. You know, it's not even about the disease itself.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up a good point, which is when there were concrete Ebola cases in the United States, there were countries that were thinking of placing travel warnings for their citizens to come to the U.S. for fear that their citizens would get Ebola from the United States. Other thoughts, comments? So let's talk a little bit about travel warnings. What do you know about travel warnings?
I believe that many of them, not all of them, I'm sure other agencies do, and many travel warnings are issued by the State Department. And I would think that for the most part, for the average U.S. citizen, unless something extreme, are kind of voluntary, sometimes cautionary. But if you're traveling on behalf of an institution, say FIU or any other institution that adheres to them, that might stop you from being able to go on behalf of certain institutions that follow the travel warnings.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
When I was in the military, like, whenever I had to travel, if I was going to travel out of the country, they gave you a list, well, they gave you a map of, like, literally just color-coded, like, on travel warnings, like certain areas, they're just, like, blacklisted, so you're not even allowed to go there. Like, I had friends in the military who were of Mexican descent, and, like, 3/4 of the country is pretty much blacklisted for violence, so he wasn't even allowed to, like, visit his family if he wanted to. So, like, and they have different color codings for violence, and they also have where you have for, like, disease outbreaks. Some of them are a little bit more moderate, like you go at your own risk. So you kind of, like, get to see the perspective of the different type of warnings that you have, like, whether it's violence, government instability, like a disease, things like that. So I kind of, like, when I did that, when I was traveling out of the country, I really got to see the perspective of because I wanted to go visit family in Venezuela, and they brought that up. It's not really recommended, and then they kind of showed me the global perspective of the U.S. case, the U.S. perspective on what travel. It was actually really interesting.
Yeah. Just want to elaborate on what he said. It's not only internationally, but even here at home, they're with respect to the military, there are blacklisted geological places here in the U.S. that service members are that they're restricted from going.
How interesting.
Yeah. You'll be given your blacklist comes down from either your MAGCOM or actually your base commander. Or certain places within maybe the surrounding area where you're stationed that you're not allowed to travel to. Or directly.
Okay. Interesting. Yes.
I was actually in the embassy this last year in Mozambique, working there, and I know that when they do put out travel warnings, it usually comes from the embassies themselves. They have all their different sections, their political sections, their economic sections, and so, for example, they were having elections in Mozambique, and they've got a very strong history of civil war that they've just come out of. So they put out travel warnings, and then for the people that are there, they actually, for actual embassy personnel, they don't allow you to go in certain places because of danger warnings. But all of those decisions, I think, usually come from people in those countries studying the situation, and then they report back to Washington and make the final reports.
And I think that's an important point about travel warnings and any travel alerts that would be issued is they originate from embassy staff that is located in the country. So they have a pulse of what's happening in the specific country. I did want to read to you a little kind of blur, I guess, from the U.S. Department of State website about why they issue travel warnings. It says, we issue a travel warning when we want you to consider very carefully whether you should go to a country at all. Examples of reasons for issuing a travel warning might include unstable government, civil war, ongoing intense crime or violence, or frequent terrorist attacks. We want you to know the risks of traveling to these places and to strongly consider not going to them at all. Travel warnings remain in place until the situation changes. Some have been in effect for years. So that's just like if you go to the Department of State website and you're looking for like an explanation of why a travel warning, that's kind of like the general the general blur. And I think, travel warnings are issued for specific situations and circumstances. And there are some travel warnings that are placed on a country for years and years and years and years. And then there are travel alerts or travel warnings that may be placed on a country for a short period of time. For example, during the Olympics in Sochi, there was a travel alert for Sochi, basically, for Americans considering traveling to the Olympic Games. And I bring that up in part. It's not Ebola, but I bring that up also in part so you can maybe understand a little bit about how FIU thinks about travel warnings. And I guess I'll use this example since I've started with it. So at FIU, we have a travel warning committee, if you may not be familiar with it. And actually, as director of the Office of Study Abroad, I'm chair of the Travel Warning Committee. What does the Travel Warning Committee focus on? This Travel Warning Committee is specifically to work with students who would like to go abroad for academic credit in a location where there is a travel warning or a travel alert. So in the case of Russia, we had a student who was going to do a study abroad program in Russia, in Moscow specifically, and we work with students to prepare for their study abroad experiences. But between when we did a pre-departure with her, speaking about Russia specifically, things for her to watch out for while she was there, between when we did the initial pre-departure and her departure, the U.S. State Department issued this travel alert for Sochi and for the Olympic Games. And so I reached out to the Travel Warning Committee, which is FIU administration, including legal counsel, academic affairs, and we decided that we should meet with the student again, which we did, and we discussed with her specifically the travel warning that you were discussing that is prepared by embassy staff is generally very specific to what the concerns are for U.S. citizens. And so we worked with the student through the various parts of the travel warning and just made sure she knew what the different aspects of it were. And then, FIU asked the student to sign a waiver, which most of our students sign waivers while they're abroad. But this particular waiver was for her to say that she was not going to go to Sochi for the Olympic Games. Okay, so she was going to be in Moscow, which is about 10 hours away by bus ride, and she had no plans of going to Sochi, so she signed that she wasn't going to Sochi. But why in that situation would FIU do something like that? Because if we're sending students for academic credit around the world, the health and safety of FIU students is the most important concern that we have. Obviously, we want we want students who are traveling abroad, who are doing internships abroad, who are studying abroad to have fantastic, meaningful academic experiences. But before any of that, health and safety comes first. So that just gives you a little example of a situation, in the last year or so where we've worked with a travel warning. And I think you mentioned, Eric, that we did have Dr. Eileen Marty, who is at FIU in the College of Medicine, and she went with the WHO to Nigeria, to work with Nigeria actually to help Nigeria come up with a screening process to both keep folks who might be leaving Nigeria who might have Ebola from traveling, but also keeping folks who may have Ebola from entering Nigeria. So specifically, she helped them set up a mechanism for them to take the temperature of a traveler, if there was a concern. But the reality is most of the travel warnings, if you look at the long list, and you guys probably know, what are some places that have been under travel warning for a long time? If you think of travel warning from the U.S. State Department, what are you thinking about?
I was thinking about Somalia. That's just the longest.
Somalia, you said, what was the country before?
No, I said Somalia. That's
Somalia,
it. Yeah.
okay. Cuba, okay, there is no travel warning on Cuba. However, I did go earlier today. I mean, tourist travel to Cuba is prohibited at this time. However, you can get a visa to travel to Cuba, but there's not a travel warning per se. Okay.
American citizen with no family ties over there, we previously weren't allowed to go.
You could that's not entirely true. You could go, but you would need a visa, and it would be for a specific purpose. So you could get like a religious visa, or there are universities across the country that are offering academic programs to Cuba. That does exist, but you need a special visa to go. So, but I do want to be very clear. There's no travel warning to Cuba. Okay. Syria, for sure. There's a travel warning on Syria. Because you have one.
I was going to say the obvious, like Iraq.
Okay. You had a hand up. Iran. Okay. Yes.
What for Egypt?
Israel?
I'm not sure on Egypt right now. Israel has had a long-standing travel warning. And in our office, we get regular questions about academic study in Israel. And Israel has had a travel warning for many years. And, as you know, in 2014, there was significant violence in the region. So there was more attention on Israel. I think it was so there was more violence. But Israel has had a travel warning for many years.
Mm-hmm. I guess you can Ukraine in there and currently Yemen.
Yes, Yemen would have a travel warning. Mm-hmm. North Korea, yes. But some not so obvious ones. Colombia has been on a travel warning for many years. And Mexico, and your classmate kind of alluded to it, Mexico has been under travel warning for the last several years. Okay. Yes?
If you went for Honduras, well, I know the capital is like extremely dangerous, but there's obviously really tourist spots like the Bay Islands.
So I'm not entirely sure about Honduras. It's not a country where we have that much student interest in going. So I would have to confirm. Yes.
I was watching a documentary, and I'm not sure if it went to Trinidad.
I don't believe so. No. Haiti. Yes, Haiti does have a travel warning, and the travel warning in Haiti has been in place basically since the earthquake in 2010. And the travel warning in Haiti has been in place basically since the earthquake in 2010. And the travel warning in Haiti has been in place basically since the earthquake in 2010. And the travel warning in Haiti has been in place basically since the earthquake in 2010. because of the uncertainty following the earthquake. And now I would say in Haiti also one of the reasons is the unavailability of public health and support. If you had some kind of emergency abroad, there's not the infrastructure to really help health crisis, I guess. So that's one of the big reasons why Haiti is still. So I bring up all of these countries because travel warnings have been around for a while, and the U.S. State Department has used them for a while. But it's not really something that most people know too much about or most people study or focus on. But with Ebola, it seemed like there was a lot of concern about, okay, we should just ban travel, to these countries specifically. So the 3 countries were Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. That is something that people were thinking. We should just totally ban travel, including probably the public health workers, the nurses, the doctors, because it's just too big of a risk, to bring it back, to bring Ebola back to the United States. So what do you guys think? What is your perspective? What is your opinion on the banning?
I would tend to be against it. I mean, take precautions. You only go there. I mean, if you're going there to help, obviously, if you otherwise need to. And also, I remember one thing that was pointed out, that you're likely to have a lot more trouble with ordinary diseases like influenza that would probably take more lives and cause more trouble than Ebola. Of course, influenza is doing that now.
Yes.
We didn't ban travel, and we don't have a major outbreak in the U.S., so I think that's the biggest indicator of whether we should have or not. I mean, we should have it.
Yes.
I think completely banning travel, I mean, you're already crippling their already unstable economy already. So I think you're doing. I know you're trying to contain, but I'm pretty sure. I think you can still get total containment without blacklisting the whole travel, and you're pretty much just isolating the country from the world by just doing that. You're pretty much just watching it cripple from the inside.
Thinking back to when I went to China for slavery remote, I think that was the birth outbreak. And nobody came back from that. So I think sometimes the media, that does came back to birth.
Well, and I think, one of the reasons that I bring in the media is because, and I started out by asking you, what have you heard about Ebola? Because the media moves on very quickly to the next, topic. I mean, the reality is, I believe Ebola could be at the same level as it was in the fall. And because there's all of these other things going on in the world and in the United States and a big snowstorm, in Boston, that we still wouldn't be hearing necessarily that much about it as long as things are not, changing that significantly.
Question. At one point, Nigeria did have Ebola cases, but they got rid of it on their own with their health department and things of that nature. Even Texas asked Nigeria for help. They were like, "What are you guys doing? How did you guys stop Ebola in your country? Help us here in the U.S." So my country now, my question now is the cases like you said earlier, they are dropping in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, but even the Americans, the two ones who went and volunteered, the ones who were cured from it, how can the U.S. in terms of their medical assistance? Because to me it was kind of funny that for me personally that Cuba, they sent a lot of doctors, way more than the U.S. And the U.S. supposedly some big superpower, but then again it's national interest and all those sorts of all that business. But Cuba, in my opinion, does not really have much. So like, you know, like what races do they have in Nigeria? That's another story. But anyway, so my question is like, how can U.S. in terms of medical and even like I don't even know if Nigeria even is like doing much. Like how is it that you know the U.S. and Nigeria decreasing and these three countries are still struggling? What's lacking there that's still causing these outbreaks?
Um, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I think that you know the word has gotten out into the communities in Sierra Leone and Liberia about how you can contract. It really is about education in many ways, right? If the more people know how you can contract Ebola, the better, you know, the better it is for the country because people will take, you know, people will take the. Mm-hmm.
In regards to that question, I remember watching that on the internet, a documentary in regards to the whole Ebola outbreak, but not this one, prior. And honestly, a lot of people that don't even believe it. They do not believe it before. So the lack of knowledge, like you were saying, is really it's a huge concern. There's also like a lot of clans and different tribes in Africa. And they speak different languages and things like that. So it's also a communication. If there's a boundary of communication, it's a
I
problem.
personally disagree with that. Just because I mean, I don't see that's I mean I don't know why I mean there's your reasons for thinking that, but in my personal opinion, based on what I know, in African countries, yes, there are different languages, but they all have they were colonized at a certain point, and a lot of them still speak their colonizers language, whether it's English, French, you know, whatever language it is, and they even also have their own form of pidgin. Like it's basically a mixture of all the dialects and everything together. They use to communicate because I mean they're professional jobs in these countries as well. How are these professionals going to communicate? They need to have a language. So I don't think language is a barrier.
Like they're in like this area that they can't speak at all, but it is like they can. There is a problem in talking to one another. You know what I mean? Like there's still that.
So lack of knowledge.
Yeah, lack of knowledge, lack of communication.
Well, I think we all here in the U.S. or other leading developed countries look at it from our perspective. You know, we don't realize the technology that we have. You know, the social media outlets, the more formalized television media outlets. You know, we have all these different outlets to get information out so quick. But other countries that might be lacking in that type of infrastructure can't get it out to a populace as fast as we can. You know, so that might be a big reason too. We just looking at it from our perspective, but we have all this infrastructure, communication infrastructure that other countries lack.
And I think that's an important part about educating folks about exactly this kind of public health situation. Or look at the storm, you know, in Boston. I mean, I wasn't switching channels, you know, but I'm sure every channel last night was, you know, let's watch the snowfall in New York City. You know, I mean, that's the reality, you know, which, you know, it has a place. The reason the media was doing that was because people needed to know, right? And this particular snowstorm developed extremely quickly, so people didn't have a chance from Sunday, you know, from Sunday into Monday to really know what was happening. So it's good that we can get the word out. But, you know, in many communities in Africa, not everybody's going to have a TV. Not everybody's going to have a laptop computer. Most people aren't going to have a smartphone. You know, think of the ways in which you get your information. You know, that's not the case in the majority of the world. I do want to come back to a point that you made, and I want to make sure it doesn't get lost in the conversation, which is, you know, that Africa was colonized, and it's important to remember the history of Africa and the role of France and Germany and the UK and the US in some parts, you know, as well. But that has played a role in the history and the development of Africa to where they are today. And we can't deny that historical reality. You know, so in some ways, you know, and I have traveled to West Africa, I've studied West Africa, I've traveled to Senegal and the Ivory Coast. In some ways, you know, we owe Africa more because, you know, Africa was colonized by France, by the US, by the UK. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind as we think about, Ebola and about helping, you know. But I think the other, the other thing is we think of Africa as a place that always kind of like needs our help. Um, but how do we help in a way that is sustainable? We want to help, and we want the Ebola outbreak to come to an end, right? That's what we mostly want. But wouldn't it be great if in the midst of doing that, we could set up some kind of public health structure there so that the next situation that comes along, they're a little bit better equipped to handle that situation? Sometimes we're kind of like crisis focused or very specifically focused on whatever it is that is happening. But maybe we need to have a broader view, about what it is that we're trying to address.
How much of a difference or how much of an impact does geological location play in this? Maybe because I would assume or I would imagine that maybe something that works in one country, since Africa is so large, maybe something that works in one country wouldn't necessarily work in another for things like climate, things like resources, and the amount of food that they have access to, or crops, or the things that they eat. How much of an impact does all that play? I mean, because I know that obviously infrastructure is really important, but how much of an impact does that play? Just their different locations.
Well, I mean, Africa is huge, and obviously there's many countries on the continent, so many different governments involved, and as you're saying, many different geographic situations. Many countries in Africa are on the coast and have amazing resources. Others, won't. So, I mean, the diversity in Africa is, and then to the north you have, desert, and it's very, very. You have here? Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm. Can you step forward, because it's a little bit hard for everybody to hear you.
Yeah, sometimes when we discuss Africa, we make it like one big country, and I haven't been to Africa, but it's similar to the European Union now. When people talk about fiscal problems there, you have several different countries, 27 different countries participating in it, each with a different agenda, different crises in their own countries that are going to take different policies. So even though we see the U.S. an outbreak, I think at one time it was 1,000 people, but Ebola, which is bad for those 1,000 people, but it's still a small number considering the other crises that we have in different countries in Africa: AIDS issues, economic issues, development issues. Some countries have water, access to clean water issues. So it's not that Ebola is not important, but it doesn't, just jump to the top of mind just because the U.S. or Westernized countries get afraid of it and decide they should do something about it. So it's not as simple.
I'm remembering vaguely an article that I saw online, and I'm hoping it's something that you guys definitely haven't talked about so that you can comment on it. But it was, I think, a map of where travel warnings are, and then a map of where Americans actually get injured and killed abroad. And I remember the map's not matching up very well. So can you talk about travel warnings and how accurate they are in terms of statistical risk of something happening, as opposed to maybe through a political lens of where the government does the issue of
So I mean, I don't think that's one of the articles that we discussed, but part of the role of travel warnings is to tell the public about a specific risk, right? And then as an individual, you can decide, okay, I know that there's a risk in Colombia, but I'm going to travel there anyway. But what's happening. You're educated, and you make that decision, right? When it gets a little more complicated is, as you were alluding to earlier, when institutions get involved. So when we're talking about students on study abroad, or we're talking about corporations sending, their teams and staff into a particular location, then we talk about the risk, the liability of the particular institution, that is sending individuals into those. They're all important things for us to think about. But it is true that risk is kind of central to, the travel warnings. And I would say that sometimes, the travel warning comes ahead of assumed risk, but then I would also say that travel warnings sometimes are put on as a result of specific events that have taken place in a specific number of yes.
I wanted to comment on the gentleman with green jackets comments. Like as far as like Africa, like we say about like geological location, but if you look at it like geologically, right, their resources, they're one of the most richest countries in the world in terms of resources, but there's a lot of exploitation of the continent's resources. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And then to the other gentleman's comments in the red shirt, there's a lack of unity among those countries to unify to use those resources for their benefit. And then that can probably lead to some infrastructure such as the public health infrastructure, clean water infrastructure. Some of those resources get used internally rather than externally. So I think that will probably like have a lot to do with solving a lot of problems over there with some of the lower developed, countries within the country.
Just a comment. In my opinion, from having studied, it's amazing the burden we put on lesser developed countries or continents. We expect Africa to just unify. I don't know the exact number of nations, people, but we expect Africa to unify to solve all the problems. When we look at North America, look at the U.S. and Mexico, we haven't unified to solve the problem of drugs, immigration. More terrorists, quote unquote terrorists, came through Canada, through Mexico. I think the report showed people looking at the parliament country, and we haven't fixed that issue. Throughout Europe, particularly Western Europe, they haven't solved the economic crisis. They can't unify, but nobody will point the finger and say, why don't they just unify and get it together? But yet we look at underdeveloped, what we call underdeveloped countries, say, or the continent, and say, just unify and get it together, when the rest of the world has it.
But I just think there's where Western, I guess, democracies and other governments, there's a level of unification that I would say there's a certain degree to where they can, I guess, work together on certain issues. I guess that lends to their success. That's what I'm saying. Like when I'm speaking of unify, I'm not talking about everybody kumbaya, but I'm speaking as from their established governments in those respective countries, maybe getting together on certain issues, to facilitate, general changes. Not saying that, they're all going to come together and just be like holding hands and everybody, we're going to solve all our problems together, but just on certain, general issues.
I get the point, but I would still say, where have we in North America done that between, say, U.S. and Mexico?
NAFTA, you have
Europe
other...
hasn't done it with their economic crisis. They're still struggling. I mean, look at a country like Spain, Italy, and Germany. They can't come together in Greece and solve the economic, which, in my opinion, is sad to say, but a bigger concern for the world than the Ebola outbreak.
EU itself.
Let me get a couple more voices on here. We're also running out of time, so from you and then.
In terms of unification, Africa is on the same level as every other country in the globe in terms of unifying, because Africa has the African Union, and even within different regions of Africa, north, south, east, central, they have even their own coalitions, like similar to the UN or the EU. So on that international level, you can't say Africa, does not have unification or any type of, system where countries talk with each other, because they do. So I feel like, again, there's lack of knowledge about the whole thing with Africa, because, not to bash you or anything, Africa has the same issues as, like you said, the rest of the world in terms of unification. Yes, Europe has the EU. Yes, they have all these other things in their countries. So does Africa. But, because it's Africa, we say, oh, look, they can't unify, So that's just my comment.
I'm just going to piggyback on the development of the country. It's 2015, and if you look at Africa, it's, like you said, it's one of the richest countries based on resources. Yet, a lot of these countries have some of the poorest economies in the world. When you have countries that are ravaged by poor economy, combined with constant civil strife, constant civil war, you have genocide. You have all these resources, and then you have all these poor economies that it's right there in your face. You can see why they have some of the most simple like public structures like water, like health, security, things like that. When you have all these internal disruptions, like I said, like civil war, and most of these countries are crippling in like world debt. Like they constantly have to borrow from the World Monetary Fund, and like I think the WMF during the Ebola outbreak, I think they let them have a little bit of leeway. Like I think they cut some of the debts off from these like African countries, but when you have these countries drowning in debt, there's a reason why they can't contribute to build a public infrastructure. And that's why, like, I mean, like, we have these first world countries now, 2015. I mean, but then you look at it the other way, like these third world countries in the same year, with crippling economies, internal strife, and they don't have any basic necessities.
It's very important. I mean, you know that some of the facts that you said are true, but the question is why. The question is always going to be why, to get a better understanding. And what you're saying, you know, is good to get the public to know this, but you also have to put it in historical context as well. A lot of, for example, Africa, the whole continent doesn't have any gun manufacturing companies at all. They're getting guns from outside sources, which is Europe and the U.S. Like, so even in terms of the civil wars, where are they getting the guns from? And also, when it comes to the reasons why, you know, these countries are still so much turmoil, imagine the U.S. had, okay, how do I put it? A lot of the problems with these African countries is that their leaders are very corrupt. They're only interested in themselves, what they can get from themselves. So instead of actually helping their country develop, instead of actually building infrastructure and making sure education is how it should be, they're collaborating with other countries who only want to get resources from Africa and then leave the country dry. And they're fine with that because in return they get money for it. And also in terms of historical context, you know, a lot of in terms of like colonialism, that detrimented the continent a lot, and the leaders are just making it even worse. So imagine the U.S. imagine President Obama didn't care about the U.S. He wanted to get money for himself, which is what's going on in a lot of these African countries. He didn't care about rebuilding roads. He didn't care about education system. He didn't care about health policies. He didn't care about anything of that nature. You know, the country would degrade in terms of physically and, you know, people itself. That's what's going on in Africa. So you can't just say, oh, you know, I'm not bashing. You can't just say, you know, these countries, you know, why is it 2015? Why are they still having these issues? There are reasons they're still having these issues. And then again, these countries from outside, they come back into Africa saying, let me help you. At the same time, they're also fueling and funding these wars and fueling and funding a lot of the issues that are going on in Africa. And they come back and say, oh, let's help you do this, let's help you do that. It's the reason, it's the why. You have to see the grander scheme of everything. What's the driving force behind what's going on? So that's the best I can say. I mean, a lot of these countries, they're not dumb. They're smart individuals. Nigeria speaking per se, you know, a lot of these things is that they'll have educated people. They'll leave the country to go to somewhere else. But even though it's about education, they won't come back. Why won't they come back? Because they don't want to. Who wants to come back to a country that's not stable? You know. So you can't say, you know, they're not doing what they should be doing. There's a reason for everything. They're not, you know, inadequate or anything like that.
I totally agree.
So that's what I'm saying.
How it started, why they're there.
I think they're going to be the final comment.
To piggyback off of what someone said over there and what Amy stated, we're looking at this issue through an American perspective, and America is 200 and something years old. A lot of these African countries were independent in the 1950s, 1960s, so they're fairly new. And when America was 50 years old, like, America didn't have its stuff together, so how can we expect everything to go smoothly? Even though this is a new age, there's technology and everything is good, you need time to develop, especially economic development. That can take decades, sometimes even a century to acquire, so that aspect should be looked into.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here today, and I hope this was a helpful, eye-opening conversation about Ebola, travel warnings, African development, images of Africa. There's a lot of work to be done, but thank you for being part of this conversation. Have a great day.